Chapter 1. The History of Sexuality. 1.1 Prehistoric Sexuality and Reproduction. Prehistoric sexuality and reproduction are areas that necessitate a multidisciplinary approach for a thorough understanding. Insights into these aspects of prehistoric life come from an amalgamation of anthropological, archaeological, and genetic research. The primary drive for sexual behavior in prehistoric times was reproduction, an imperative that echoes throughout the animal kingdom. While contemporary humans have a complex array of motivations for sexual activity, for prehistoric humans, reproduction would have been closely aligned with survival and the continuation of their lineage. The absence of modern contraceptives would have made the link between sex and reproduction very clear to early humans. Early human societies would have observed the patterns in nature and their own communities, gradually coming to recognize the signs of fertility and the cycles of procreation. The menstrual cycles of women, aligned as they often are with lunar cycles, might have imbued the moon with a special significance in early cultures, as evidenced by lunar symbols found in prehistoric art. Such art suggests a reverence for fertility and the generative powers of women, who were the visible creators of new life. The female form, with accentuated reproductive features, is a common motif in prehistoric artifacts, indicating a preoccupation with fertility and the feminine's role in reproduction. The lack of understanding of the biological mechanisms behind reproduction did not preclude prehistoric humans from recognizing the importance of sexual union. Fertility rituals, which might have included ceremonial sex, could have been a means to ensure communal prosperity, and were likely a significant aspect of prehistoric culture. These rituals may have been timed with seasonal changes, ensuring that childbirth coincided with times of resource abundance. Such practices would have been pivotal in not only ensuring the survival of offspring, but also in fostering social cohesion and shared cultural beliefs. In terms of social structure, the uncertainty of paternity may have given rise to matrilineal societies, where lineage and inheritance were traced through the mother. The ambiguous nature of fatherhood, in contrast to the obviousness of motherhood, may have contributed to a communal approach to child rearing. In these early human groups, all members might have played a role in the upbringing of children, a practice that would have been beneficial in terms of survival, as it would have distributed the responsibilities and resources needed to raise the young. The physicality of prehistoric humans would have been a significant factor in their sexual relations and reproductive strategies. The robust nature of prehistoric human remains suggests that early humans had a physically demanding lifestyle, which would have been conducive to high levels of fitness and fertility. Moreover, the evolution of bipedalism and the consequent changes in female pelvic anatomy would have influenced mating positions and could have had implications for the development of social bonds, as face-to-face intercourse may foster a more personal connection between partners. Interpersonal relationships in prehistoric times would likely have been complex, as in any society. While it's often assumed that prehistoric humans may have practiced a form of mate guarding, which is common in some of the other primate species, there is evidence to suggest that early human societies were relatively egalitarian. This equality could have extended to sexual relationships, with both sexes having a say in mate selection, unlike in some primate groups where males are more dominant. Sexual dimorphism, the physical differences between males and females of a species, was less pronounced in early humans than in many other primates. This suggests that the selection pressures that lead to pronounced dimorphism, such as intense competition among males for females, may have been less of a factor for early humans. Instead, other traits, such as cooperation and social intelligence, may have played a more significant role in mate selection. This could have led to a more cooperative and less competitive mating system, although this remains a subject for debate among anthropologists. The advent of tools and the control of fire would have had profound effects on prehistoric sexuality and reproduction. The ability to create a stable environment with fire would have extended the day, providing more time for social interactions, including sexual activities, to occur after dark. Tools would have allowed for the accumulation and preparation of resources, which could have supported larger groups and facilitated the care of pregnant women and young children. Finally, the spread of early humans across different environments would have necessitated adaptations in their sexual and reproductive behaviors. Those migrating to colder climates, for example, would have faced different challenges in terms of ensuring the survival of their offspring. In response, they may have developed different social structures or mating strategies to cope with these challenges. It is also likely that as early humans encountered other hominin species, such as Neanderthals, sexual relationships occurred between species, as evidenced by the genetic traces left in modern human DNA. While the specifics of prehistoric sexuality and reproduction are shrouded in mystery, the combination of archaeological evidence, anthropological theory, and genetic research provides us with a tantalizing glimpse into the lives of our ancestors. These insights help us understand not just the biological imperative of sex, but also its cultural significance in the earliest human societies. 1.2 Ancient Civilizations' Views on Sex. The views on sex held by ancient civilizations were diverse and often deeply intertwined with their cultures, religions, and laws. These views were not just private or personal, but were part of a larger discourse that included social norms, political power, and spiritual beliefs. In ancient societies, sex was often not merely a biological function, but a crucial element of human identity and community life, bearing significant cultural weight. In ancient Egypt, sex was regarded as a natural part of life and was openly depicted in art and texts. The Egyptians believed in a strong connection between fertility and the afterlife, which is reflected in their mythology. For example, the god Osiris's resurrection was associated with the flooding of the Nile, which was a symbol of fertility. Moreover, the Egyptians did not hold a dualistic view of body and spirit. Thus, sexual pleasure was not considered inherently sinful or shameful. Sexuality in ancient Greece varied greatly among its many city-states, with Athens and Sparta representing two extremes. In Athens, sex was seen through the lens of beauty, virtue, and procreation. The practice of pederasty, where an older man would take on a mentorship role with a younger male, included a sexual component and was considered an important phase in the younger male's development. In contrast, Sparta was more utilitarian, viewing sex primarily as a means for producing strong offspring for the state. The ancient Romans' views on sex were complex and often contradictory. While the early Roman Republic was marked by austere moral standards, the later periods, especially the imperial era, were known for more permissive attitudes towards sexuality. Sexuality in Rome was heavily tied to power and social status. For example, Roman men were expected to be active and dominant in sexual encounters, with passivity in sex seen as a sign of weakness or subjugation. In ancient India, sex was regarded as an integral part of life and was celebrated in texts like the Kama Sutra, which is not just a manual on sex positions, but a comprehensive guide to a virtuous and gracious living. The Hindu tradition recognized the importance of sexual pleasure, kama, as one of the four main goals of life, along with moral duty, dharma, wealth, artha, and liberation, moksha. This illustrates that sex was not merely for procreation, but was a vital aspect of a balanced and fulfilling life. The civilizations of pre-Columbian America had varied attitudes towards sex, often connected to their religious and mythological systems. For the Maya, sex was part of their creation myths, with procreation ensuring the continuity of life cycles. The act of creation was sometimes depicted in their art, suggesting a cultural openness to the topic of sex. However, this openness did not necessarily translate into libertine practices. Many societies had strict norms regarding sexual behavior. In ancient China, the philosophy of Taoism emphasized the naturalness of sex and its importance for health and spiritual harmony. Taoist texts sometimes provided detailed instructions on sexual practices that were believed to enhance one's life force. The concept of yin and yang was central to Chinese thought, and sexual union was seen as a harmonious interplay between these two forces, each partner providing the necessary balance to the other. The Hebrews of ancient Israel had a very structured approach to sex, governed by the laws laid out in the Torah. Sexual relations were permissible within the bounds of marriage, and procreation was seen as a divine commandment. However, there were strict prohibitions against certain sexual behaviors, which were considered sinful and could lead to severe social and spiritual consequences. In the ancient Persian Empire, Zoroastrianism influenced the views on sex, with a strong emphasis on the purity of both body and mind. Marriage and family life were highly valued, and sex within marriage was seen as a positive affirmation of life. The Persians also had a legal code that regulated sexual behavior, reflecting the societal importance of maintaining order and morality. In Africa, many ancient cultures viewed sex as a natural part of life and a source of pleasure and connection. Fertility was highly valued, as evidenced by numerous fertility symbols and rituals across different African societies. Sexuality was often integrated into spiritual practices, with sex serving as a means to connect with the divine or with the forces of nature. The ancient Celts of Europe had a comparatively liberal attitude towards sex, with evidence of both polygamy and polyandry in their societies. The role of women was different from many contemporary societies, with women having more agency in their sexual relationships. Moreover, Celtic mythology is replete with tales that celebrate sexual prowess and romantic love, indicating that sex was a celebrated aspect of life. These diverse perspectives of ancient civilizations on sex underline the multifaceted nature of human sexuality. Across different continents and cultures, sex has been revered, regulated, and integrated into the fabric of society in myriad ways. Understanding these ancient views provides a broader context for the study of sex and sexuality, revealing a complex tapestry of beliefs and behaviors that have shaped human history. 1.3 Sexuality in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, spanning roughly from the 5th to the late 15th century, was a period where sexuality was heavily influenced by the church, social structures, and emerging nation-states. This era's prevailing attitudes towards sex were dictated by religious doctrine, which viewed sex primarily for procreation within the bounds of marriage. The church's influence permeated all aspects of life, including the intimate sphere, leading to a dichotomy between the ideal of chastity and the natural human impulses. The Catholic Church, as the dominant religious institution in medieval Europe, taught that sex was a necessary evil for the purpose of procreation, and that sexual pleasure was sinful. This view was grounded in the writings of early church fathers, such as St. Augustine, who believed original sin was transmitted through the sexual act. Therefore, clerical celibacy was promoted as an ideal, and sexual activity among lay people was tolerated only within marriage and without indulgence in sexual pleasure. Despite the Church's teachings, medieval society exhibited a complex relationship with sexuality. While the upper classes were often expected to adhere to strict moral codes, the lower classes had more practical views of sex. Prostitution was widespread and, paradoxically, often regulated by local authorities to keep it away from public scrutiny. Brothels existed in many towns and were seen as a necessary outlet for male sexual desires. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not always based on mutual consent or affection, but was often a contractual agreement between families. The Church did not initially require marriages to be officiated by a priest, and for much of the medieval period, a couple could simply declare themselves married. However, by the late Middle Ages, the Church sought to exert greater control over marriage, insisting on ecclesiastical ceremonies and the recording of marriages. Within marriage, sexual activity was prescribed and proscribed according to church laws. The church calendar dictated periods of abstinence, such as Lent and Advent, and sex was prohibited on Sundays, feast days, and during a woman's menstrual period. This regulation of sexual activity within marriage aimed to control when sex occurred and under what circumstances, often tying it to the wife's reproductive cycle. Sexual practices and preferences during the Middle Ages were not uniform across Europe. In some regions, particularly in the burgeoning urban centers, there was a certain level of sexual freedom, as evidenced by courtly love literature that celebrated romantic and sometimes extramarital liaisons. This literature, while often idealized, reflects a society where emotional and sexual desires were acknowledged, if not openly discussed. The medieval period also saw the rise of courtly love, a cultural movement that idealized chivalrous behavior and romantic affection. While courtly love often celebrated platonic and unattainable affections, it suggests that medieval people recognized a psychological and emotional component to sexual desire. This was a departure from the strictly reproductive view of sex, indicating a nuanced understanding of human sexuality. Homosexuality in the Middle Ages was viewed through the lens of religious morality and was condemned by the Church. However, historical records indicate that homosexual relationships did occur, albeit covertly. The penalty for such relationships could be severe, including death, but enforcement varied greatly from place to place and period to period. The Middle Ages also witnessed the spread of various laws aimed at regulating sexual behavior and morality. Adultery, fornication, and other sexual sins were legislated by both secular and ecclesiastical authorities. These laws were not only a reflection of moral concerns, but also a means to maintain social order and hierarchy. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the 14th century, had significant impacts on attitudes towards sex and morality. The massive loss of life led to social and economic upheaval, which in turn led to a loosening of the strict sexual mores of the earlier Middle Ages in some areas. The sudden confrontation with mortality led some to indulge in pleasures they might have otherwise eschewed, a phenomenon commented on by writers of the time. The Middle Ages presented a tapestry of sexual attitudes and practices that were shaped by religious doctrine, social norms, and the realities of life. While the Church strove to impose a strict moral framework, the lay population navigated a world where sex was a natural and necessary part of life. The tension between these two poles characterized the medieval approach to sexuality, creating a complex legacy that would influence later European thought and culture. 1.4 Renaissance Sexual Attitudes and Practices. The Renaissance, a period of great cultural and intellectual change in Europe, heralded a shift in many aspects of life, including sexuality. As a time of rediscovery of classical philosophies, the human body, and secularism, the Renaissance offered a new context in which sexual attitudes could be explored and expressed. While still heavily influenced by religious doctrines, there was a burgeoning sense of individualism and personal agency that began to color the way sexuality was perceived and practiced. In contrast to the more constrained medieval attitudes, Renaissance thinkers began to assert the importance of love and sexual desire as natural and even spiritually uplifting aspects of human experience. This was a significant departure from earlier views that considered carnal desires as inherently sinful, outside the bounds of procreation. Renaissance literature is replete with romantic and often erotic imagery, as seen in the sonnets of Petrarch or the plays of Shakespeare, where love and sexual attraction are central themes. Art of the Renaissance further reflects changing attitudes towards sexuality. Artists like Titian and Tintoretto painted scenes of mythological liaisons and sensual pleasures, often commissioning works that celebrated the beauty and eroticism of the naked form. These works were not just private indulgences, but were displayed in public spaces, signifying a more permissive social environment for the appreciation of sexual beauty. Despite the intellectual liberation of the time, the reality for most people was still heavily regulated by religious and social norms. The Catholic Church in particular continued to wield significant influence, and its moral teachings remained a powerful force in people's lives. Sexual activity outside of marriage was condemned, and the Church's teachings would often conflict with the natural sexual curiosities and desires that were being more openly discussed in humanist circles. Marriage in the Renaissance was still predominantly a social and economic contract, but the period also saw the rise of the notion of romantic love as a basis for marriage. This was a shift from earlier times when marriages were arranged without consideration for the emotional bond between the partners. In Renaissance Italy, for example, the concept of sposi emerged, referring to a couple engaged to be married based on mutual affection. The Renaissance also saw a greater differentiation in the sexual experiences of men and women. Men's sexual exploits, including visits to brothels or affairs with mistresses, were often tacitly accepted, if not openly celebrated. Women, on the other hand, were expected to remain chaste and virtuous, with their sexuality closely guarded. The double standard regarding male and female sexuality was prevalent, with serious consequences for women who transgressed societal norms. This period was not without its contradictions regarding sexuality. On one hand, the humanist celebration of the body and the naturalness of sexual desire was at odds with the rigid moral teachings of the Church. On the other hand, there was a growing interest in the scientific study of the human body, including its sexual functions. Physicians like Andreas Vesalius began to challenge old anatomical myths, leading to a more accurate understanding of human reproduction. However, the Renaissance also experienced outbreaks of syphilis, which had a significant impact on sexual practices and public perceptions of morality. The spread of this sexually transmitted disease was met with both medical and moral responses, with the latter often viewing the epidemic as a divine punishment for sexual licentiousness. This reinforced the need for sexual restraint and pushed discussions of sexual health into the public sphere. The legal system of the time also reflected complex attitudes toward sexuality. Laws governing sexual behavior were not just concerned with moral transgressions, but also with the maintenance of social order. Adultery, for instance, was not merely a sin, but a disruption of family and property lines, leading to severe legal repercussions. Despite this, the courts were often lenient towards men's sexual indiscretions while punishing women more harshly. The Renaissance era presented a nuanced tapestry of sexual attitudes and practices. While it was a time of greater personal expression and the celebration of love and desire, it was also a period where the tension between emerging secular ideas and traditional religious doctrines was palpable. This dynamic interplay shaped the sexual mores of the time and laid the groundwork for future discourse on human sexuality. The Renaissance's legacy in terms of sex and sexuality is one of complexity, conflict, and gradual change, as societies negotiated the balance between individual desires and collective norms. 1.5 The Victorian Era, Repression and Hidden Desires. The Victorian era, named after Queen Victoria who ruled from 1837 to 1901, was characterized by a complex set of sexual mores and a public culture of morality and restraint. Sexuality during this time was not openly discussed and was subject to stringent social norms. This period in British history is often synonymous with sexual repression, where the ideals of propriety and modesty were in stark contrast to the biological realities and private desires of individuals. In public discourse, the Victorian attitude toward sex was largely influenced by the belief that sexual activity should be confined within the boundaries of marriage, and even then, should not be conducted with the intent of pleasure. The prevailing thought was that sex for pleasure was undignified and unseemly, leading to a culture where sexual desires were suppressed or simply not acknowledged in polite society. This was in part due to the influence of the Church, which continued to maintain that sex was primarily for procreation. Despite the outward appearance of sexual propriety, the Victorian era was rife with contradictions. The suppression of public discussion about sex did not eliminate sexual activity or desires. Prostitution flourished in the urban centers of Victorian England, becoming a widely known yet unofficially acknowledged part of city life. The existence of a double standard became clear. While the purity and chastity of women were extolled, many men sought sexual experiences outside of marriage. The role of women in Victorian society was closely tied to their sexual behavior. Women were expected to remain pure and chaste until marriage, and were largely defined by their marital status. An unmarried woman was often pitied or scorned, while an unfaithful or sexually active unmarried woman could be ostracized completely. This placed a heavy burden on women to conform to societal expectations, often at the expense of their own sexual and emotional needs. The legal system during the Victorian era reinforced the moral standards of the time. Legislation such as the Contagious Diseases Acts sought to control the spread of venereal diseases by targeting prostitutes rather than their male clients. This reflected the prevailing view that women were responsible for upholding sexual morality, while men's sexual behavior was seen as natural and uncontrollable. Literature of the Victorian era often reflected the tension between the era's stringent moral codes and the human desire for sexual expression. Authors such as Thomas Hardy and George Eliot grappled with themes of love, desire, and the consequences of sexual transgression. Their works often portrayed the inner turmoil of characters as they struggled against the moral strictures of their time. The repression of sexual discussion led to a lack of reliable knowledge about sex. This ignorance was particularly harmful to women, as there was little understanding of female sexuality and reproductive health. Women were often left uninformed about their own bodies and could suffer as a result of misconceptions and myths that were perpetuated in the absence of open discussion. In response to the restrictive sexual norms of the time, a counter-movement of sexual reformers began to emerge. Individuals like Havelock Ellis and John Stuart Mill advocated for a more rational and less hypocritical approach to sexuality. They argued for the recognition of sexual pleasure as a natural and healthy part of life, and for the rights of women to have control over their own sexual and reproductive lives. The art and fashion of the Victorian era also provide insight into the era's sexual culture. The prevalence of corsets and bustles, which exaggerated female sexual characteristics, suggest a society preoccupied with sexuality, even if it was not openly acknowledged. This can be seen as a form of silent communication about sex and attraction, highlighting the ways in which desire found expression despite societal constraints. The Victorian era's legacy in terms of sexuality is paradoxical. It was a time of both strict moral codes and hidden transgressions. The suppression of sexual expression and the hypocrisy of the public's stance on sexuality would eventually lead to the questioning of these norms in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This period set the stage for the more open discussions of sex that would come with the new century, as the psychological and biological understanding of human sexuality began to evolve. The Victorian era was a time of significant contradiction with respect to sexuality. Publicly, sex was not to be discussed outside of marriage, and even then it was to be approached with a sense of duty rather than desire. Privately, however, there was a complex, often unspoken world of sexual activity and exploration. The repression of the era led to a variety of social issues and health problems, but it also sparked the beginnings of sexual reform and set the groundwork for future generations to challenge and change the narrative surrounding human sexuality. 1.6 The Sexual Revolution of the 20th Century. The sexual revolution of the 20th century represents a dramatic shift in the attitudes and practices surrounding sex and sexuality. This period, particularly the 1960s and 1970s, was marked by a significant departure from the traditional norms of previous generations. The revolution encompassed a wide array of changes, including increased acceptance of sex outside of marriage, the normalization of contraception and family planning, and a greater public discourse about sexual health and rights. The advent of the birth control pill in the 1960s is often cited as a catalyst for the sexual revolution. For the first time, women had access to reliable and discreet contraception, which allowed them greater control over their reproductive lives. This freedom was instrumental in changing the public perception of sex, making it more about personal pleasure and intimacy rather than strictly about procreation. The pill's widespread adoption had far-reaching implications for women's liberation, as it allowed them to pursue careers and education without the constant threat of unplanned pregnancy. During the sexual revolution, there was also a significant pushback against the conservative sexual standards that had been dominant in the first half of the 20th century. The counterculture movements of the 1960s, with their emphasis on love and freedom, challenged the status quo and advocated for a more open and liberated approach to sexuality. This was reflected in the changing mores seen in popular culture, from music to movies, where themes of love and sex became more explicit. The period saw the emergence of sex-positive feminism, where female sexuality was celebrated and the right to sexual pleasure was asserted as an important feminist issue. Figures like Betty Friedan and Helen Gurley Brown were influential in this movement, promoting the idea that women's sexual desires were as valid as men's and that women should have the same opportunities to explore their sexuality without shame or judgment. Public health became a major concern during the sexual revolution. With the increased openness about sexual matters came a greater awareness of sexually transmitted infections, STIs, and the need for safe sex practices. Educational campaigns sought to inform the public about the risks of unprotected sex and the importance of using condoms. This was a significant shift from previous eras, where such topics were often taboo and information was scarce. The legalization of abortion in several countries was another pivotal aspect of the sexual revolution. The landmark 1973 U.S. Supreme Court decision in Roe v. Wade granted women the constitutional right to terminate a pregnancy, a move that was emblematic of the broader societal shift towards individual autonomy over reproductive choices. This decision was controversial and remains a point of contention, but it undeniably changed the landscape of sexual politics. The sexual revolution also saw a greater acceptance and visibility of LGBTQ+ communities. The Stonewall Riots of 1969 marked a turning point in the fight for LGBTQ+ rights, leading to the first gay pride marches and increased activism. This period of social change contributed to the gradual destigmatization of homosexuality and the recognition of LGBTQ+ relationships and sexual health needs. The impact of the sexual revolution extended into the legal realm as well. Laws criminalizing homosexuality, adultery, and other non-procreative sexual behaviors were challenged and, in many cases, overturned. This legal liberalization reflected a broader social acceptance of a range of sexual behaviors and identities that had previously been marginalized or criminalized. The role of sex education in schools became a subject of intense debate during the sexual revolution. Advocates argued that comprehensive sex education was essential for equipping young people with the knowledge they needed to make informed decisions about their sexual health. Opponents, often coming from religious or conservative backgrounds, viewed such education as an infringement on parental rights and a potential encouragement of premarital sex. The advent of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s tested the gains of the sexual revolution. As the epidemic spread, it brought with it a renewed emphasis on monogamy, safe sex, and the dangers of promiscuity. The crisis had a profound effect on the LGBTQ+ community in particular, facing both the brunt of the epidemic and the associated social stigma. It highlighted the need for ongoing public health initiatives and greater societal support for affected communities. The sexual revolution of the 20th century was a multifaceted movement that brought about significant changes in how sex was perceived and practiced. It was a period of liberation, controversy, and change that affected personal relationships, public health, and legal systems. The legacy of the sexual revolution is still felt today, as it laid the groundwork for ongoing discussions about sexual rights, gender equality, and the normalization of sexual diversity. 1.8 The Digital Age, Internet and Sexuality. The digital age, marked by the advent and proliferation of the Internet, has had a transformative impact on human sexuality. With the rise of the Internet in the late 20th century, access to sexual content and communities has expanded exponentially. This unprecedented access has fundamentally altered how individuals explore, express, and connect through sexuality. The Internet has become a vast repository of information, allowing for an increase in sexual awareness and education while also presenting new challenges and concerns. One of the most significant changes brought about by the Internet is the availability of pornography. Once confined to adult stores and hidden stashes, pornographic material is now readily accessible online. This ease of access has led to debates about the effects of pornography on sexual attitudes and behaviors. While some argue that pornography can be a safe outlet for sexual exploration, others raise concerns about the potential for addiction, the distortion of sexual expectations, and the reinforcement of harmful stereotypes. The Internet has also facilitated the formation of sexual communities and the proliferation of dating and hookup apps. Individuals can easily find and connect with others who share their sexual preferences and interests, regardless of geographic boundaries. This has been particularly beneficial for members of the LGBTQ+ community and other sexual minorities who may find it difficult to locate and engage with a supportive community in their immediate physical surroundings. Online dating has revolutionized the way people meet romantic and sexual partners. Platforms like Tinder, Grindr, and OkCupid use algorithms to match individuals based on shared interests and preferences. This method of meeting partners offers convenience and a widened pool of potential matches, but also raises questions about the commodification of relationships and the impacts of technology-mediated communication on intimacy. The digital age has seen the rise of sexting, sending sexually explicit messages or images via electronic devices, which has become a common part of modern sexual relationships. While sexting can be a form of sexual expression among consenting adults, it also carries risks, particularly regarding privacy breaches and the non-consensual distribution of intimate images, commonly referred to as revenge porn. The Internet has also become an essential tool for sexual education, offering a breadth of information that was not easily accessible before. Websites, online forums, and video platforms provide resources on topics ranging from basic anatomy to sexual health and consent. However, the quality of information varies widely, and there is a constant need to discern reliable sources from misinformation. Cybersex and the use of virtual reality for sexual experiences have introduced new dimensions to sexual activity. Individuals can engage in sexual experiences in virtual environments or over long distances using technology. This has opened up possibilities for individuals with disabilities or those who are geographically separated from their partners, but also raises ethical questions about the nature of intimacy and the potential for escaping into virtual experiences at the expense of real-world connections. The proliferation of online platforms has led to new forms of sex work, such as camming, where individuals perform sexual acts in front of a webcam for paying viewers. This form of sex work presents unique opportunities and challenges, providing a level of autonomy and safety not present in some traditional forms of sex work, but also exposing performers to piracy and exploitation. The digital age has brought about a greater awareness of and discussion around consent and boundaries. Online discourse has contributed to a broader understanding of what constitutes consent, emphasizing that it must be informed, enthusiastic, and ongoing. Campaigns and movements that started online, such as #MeToo, have sparked global conversations about sexual harassment and assault, leading to societal shifts in how these issues are perceived and addressed. The anonymity afforded by the Internet can be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it allows individuals to explore aspects of their sexuality without fear of judgment or repercussions. On the other hand, it can also enable harmful behaviors, such as cyberbullying and harassment. The relative anonymity of online interactions can embolden individuals to engage in behavior they might otherwise avoid in person. The digital age has had profound effects on human sexuality. It has expanded access to sexual content, enabled the formation of new communities, transformed how relationships are formed, and changed the landscape of sexual education. While it offers numerous opportunities for exploration and connection, it also presents challenges that require careful navigation. As society continues to grapple with these changes, the conversation around Internet and sexuality is evolving, highlighting the need for responsible use, education, and open dialogue about the complexities of sex in the digital world. 1.9. Globalization and cross-cultural exchanges of sexual norms. Globalization, the process by which businesses or other organizations develop international influence or start operating on an international scale, has had a profound impact on the exchange of sexual norms and behaviors across cultures. As the world becomes increasingly interconnected, ideas about sexuality and sexual practices are being shared and transformed. This cross-pollination of sexual norms is contributing to a more diverse understanding of human sexuality, but also raises questions about the preservation of cultural identities and the impacts of such exchanges on traditional values. One of the primary ways globalization has affected sexual norms is through the spread of media. Television, films, and music videos often portray sexual relationships and attitudes that reflect their culture of origin but are consumed worldwide. This can lead to the adoption of new sexual norms in places where such portrayals are at odds with traditional values. For instance, Western notions of dating and public displays of affection are becoming more common in countries with historically different practices. The Internet has also been a significant driver of change, allowing for the rapid and widespread dissemination of sexual information and imagery. Online forums and social media platforms have become spaces where individuals from diverse backgrounds can share their experiences and perspectives on sexuality. This has facilitated a broader understanding and acceptance of different sexual orientations and practices, but has also sparked debates about the impact of such openness on societal norms and the well-being of individuals. Migration is another aspect of globalization affecting sexual norms. As people move across borders, they bring their cultural attitudes and practices with them, which can lead to a blending of sexual norms in immigrant-receiving countries. This can enrich cultural practices, but can also result in conflict when there is a mismatch between the sexual norms of immigrants and the prevailing norms of the host country. The spread of sex education is another area where globalization has had an impact. International organizations and non-governmental organizations often promote comprehensive sex education as a means to address issues like HIV/AIDS, teenage pregnancy, and sexual violence. While many countries have adopted these education programs, there is sometimes resistance based on the belief that they promote sexual behaviors that conflict with local cultural or religious values. The global tourism industry, including sex tourism, affects sexual norms by introducing tourists to different sexual cultures and, conversely, exposing host communities to the sexual norms of visitors. This can lead to changes in local practices and attitudes, sometimes contributing to the exploitation of vulnerable populations, but can also encourage a more open and diverse sexual culture. Global health initiatives have played a role in shaping sexual norms by promoting safe sex practices to prevent the spread of sexually transmitted infections, STIs. These initiatives often encourage the use of contraception and the adoption of sexual health practices that may be new or different for certain cultures. While these programs aim to improve health outcomes, they can also influence local sexual behaviors and attitudes. The globalization of the LGBT+ movement has led to increased visibility and acceptance of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities around the world. Activism and advocacy efforts have often been supported by international networks, leading to the decriminalization of homosexuality and the recognition of same-sex marriage in some countries. However, this has also led to backlash in some regions where such changes are seen as a threat to traditional values. Fashion and consumer culture also influence sexual norms by shaping perceptions of beauty and sexuality. Global brands often promote a particular image of attractiveness that becomes influential across different cultures. This can lead to a homogenization of beauty standards and impact how sexuality is expressed and perceived. The international exchange of literature and academic thought has contributed to a more nuanced understanding of sexuality. Cross-cultural studies and research on human sexuality have highlighted the diversity of sexual norms and practices across the world. This academic exchange can inform policy-making and education, leading to more culturally sensitive approaches to sexual health and relationships. Globalization has facilitated the exchange of sexual norms and practices across cultures, leading to a more interconnected and diverse understanding of sexuality. While this has the potential to foster greater acceptance and knowledge, it also presents challenges in balancing respect for cultural diversity with the promotion of universal rights and health. As sexual norms continue to evolve through global exchanges, it will be crucial to engage in open and respectful dialogue to navigate these complex changes. 1.10 Modern Sexuality and Future Trends. Modern sexuality is characterized by an ongoing process of transformation and re-evaluation. The 21st century has introduced a more fluid understanding of sexual orientation, gender identity, and sexual practices. This evolving landscape is influenced by technological advancements, changes in social attitudes, and the ongoing fight for equality and recognition of diverse sexual identities. The future of sexuality is likely to continue on this trajectory, with increased individuality and acceptance of a spectrum of sexual experiences. Technological innovation has significantly impacted modern sexuality. The development of virtual reality, teledildonics, and artificial intelligence has opened up new possibilities for sexual experience and expression. These technologies allow for immersive experiences that can be customized to individual preferences, leading to potential shifts in how people engage in sexual activity. However, concerns about the implications of technology on human intimacy and relationships are also prominent in discussions about the future of sexuality. The Internet continues to play a crucial role in shaping modern sexual norms. Online platforms provide forums for education, discussion, and the exchange of ideas. They have also facilitated a shift towards more individualized experiences of sexuality, with people finding niche communities and resources that resonate with their personal experiences and identities. The democratization of information about sexuality has the potential to foster a more informed and accepting society. Social media has a profound influence on modern sexual expression. Platforms like Instagram and TikTok allow individuals to present and explore aspects of their sexuality and identity in public ways that were not possible before. This visibility has contributed to the normalization of diverse sexual identities and practices. It has also given rise to new forms of sexual expression, such as the sharing of thirst traps or sexually suggestive content, blurring the lines between public and private sexual expression. The legal and political landscape continues to evolve in response to changing sexual norms. Laws regarding same-sex marriage, gender identity, and sexual conduct are being challenged and reformed around the world. This legal evolution reflects a broader cultural shift towards recognizing and protecting sexual diversity. However, progress is not uniform, and in many places there is resistance and backlash against these changes. Conversations about consent and boundaries have become more nuanced in modern times. The #MeToo movement and other social initiatives have brought issues of sexual harassment and assault to the forefront of public consciousness. There is an increasing emphasis on the importance of clear and enthusiastic consent in all sexual encounters. This focus on consent is likely to continue shaping sexual norms and behaviors in the future. The destigmatization of sex work is another area where significant shifts are occurring. Activism and advocacy have led to calls for the decriminalization of sex work and better protections for sex workers. The recognition of sex work as a legitimate form of labor is a trend that may continue, with implications for legal systems, healthcare, and societal attitudes towards sex work. Reproductive technology and rights remain at the forefront of discussions about sexuality. Advances in reproductive health, such as IVF and surrogacy, have expanded the possibilities for family creation. The ongoing debates over abortion rights and access to reproductive health care are central to discussions about sexual autonomy and bodily integrity. These issues will continue to be pivotal in shaping the future landscape of sexuality. The understanding of gender has become more fluid in modern times. Traditional binary notions of gender are being challenged by the recognition of non-binary, genderqueer, and transgender identities. This shift has profound implications for sexual identity and expression, as well as for societal norms and expectations about gender roles and relationships. Environmental concerns and sustainability are also influencing modern sexuality. The impact of overpopulation, climate change, and resource depletion is leading to a greater awareness of the ecological implications of reproductive choices. This awareness may influence future trends in family planning and the development of sustainable sexual and reproductive health products. Modern sexuality is dynamic and continually evolving. The intersection of technology, social change, and legal reform is shaping a future where sexual experiences and identities are likely to be more varied and openly expressed than ever before. The trends point towards a more inclusive and expansive understanding of sexuality, though challenges remain in balancing technological advancements with the need for genuine human connection and intimacy. As we look to the future, it is clear that the conversation about human sexuality will remain a vital and ever-changing part of the social discourse.